The fluorescent lights hummed above linoleum floors that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. Brooke Sullivan clocked into the night shift at Mercy General in San Diego at 11:53 p.m., her badge already worn from 18 years of nights just like this one. She moved through the corridors like someone trying not to be remembered, shoulders slightly forward, eyes down, the kind of invisibility that only came from practice. Her scrubs were navy blue, plain, unmarked, no pins, no personal touches, nothing that invited questions. In the break room, she poured black coffee into a ceramic mug someone had left behind, the kind with a faded hospital logo that had survived 100 washings. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the mug handle, a tremor she'd learned to hide by holding other things tightly. Charts. Clipboard edges. The faded unit patch in her scrub pocket that she touched whenever the tremor came, a nervous habit she'd never broken, even after 20 years. The fabric was worn thin from worried fingers, the colors nearly bleached to nothing. She'd sewn it into her jacket lining when she was 23 years old, back when the world felt smaller and missions felt possible. Back when she was someone else entirely. Nurse Chen passed through the break room carrying a stack of intake forms, her voice cutting through Brooke's reverie. "Incoming trauma," Chen said, barely glancing up. "Marine Sergeant Major. Multiple GSW from a training accident down in Camp Pendleton. ETA for minutes. They're prepping Trauma Bay 1. Brooke's jaw tightened. Just slightly. The kind of reaction you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. She said nothing. She nodded once and set down the coffee mug. Her movements became automatic. Gather the night shift assignments, review the bed assignments, scan the roster for which doctors were on rotation. Dr. Hargrove. Of course it was Hargrove. She'd managed to avoid him for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of coming in at 11:44 p.m. and leaving at 8 a.m. with minimal contact beyond professional greetings that required no actual conversation. Brooke had mastered the art of being in rooms without being in them. She could work a full shift without a single person remembering her face afterward. That was the goal. That had always been the goal. But something about the way Chen said Sergeant Major made Brooke's stomach drop in a way she couldn't explain. The tremor came back to her hands. She pressed them flat against the break room counter, feeling the cool laminate against her palms, and counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. Muscle memory from a lifetime ago. Breathing in combat. Breathing in crisis. Breathing when you couldn't afford to panic. Within the hour, as the trauma team was wheeling the patient through the ER doors, Brooke was moving toward the supply room on the 3rd floor, a space where fluorescent lights buzzed like angry insects and shelves held everything from gauze to saline drips in carefully labeled rows. She needed more 14-gauge angiocath needles. Inventory was running low. It was a routine task that required exactly 4 minutes. She would have been in and out if Dr. Hargrove hadn't been leaning against the doorframe when she arrived. He was tall, expensive-looking in the way of men who'd never had to earn anything. His cologne announced him before she even saw his face, something thick and suffocating that smelled like money trying too hard. His name was printed on his white coat in embroidered script, Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Chief of Emergency Medicine. He'd been appointed to the position 18 months ago after the previous chief retired. Everyone said he had connections. Political ones. The kind that bypass normal hiring procedures. "Brooke," he said, his voice carrying the kind of false warmth that made skin crawl. "Just the person I wanted to see." She nodded politely. Her hand reached for the angiocath needles on the shelf above his head. He didn't move. She would have to squeeze past him to reach them. Instead, she paused. Waited. In her experience, waiting forced people to fill the silence, and filled silence often revealed what they actually wanted. "We've had a situation," Hargrove continued, his eyes tracking her movements with the focus of a predator. "A staffing efficiency issue, really. Our new equipment vendor, Integrated Medical Solutions, excellent company, very responsive, they've had some minor inventory discrepancies with our procurement department. Nothing serious. Paperwork errors, mainly. The kind of thing that happens when the hospital's documentation systems are a bit outdated. Brooke understood exactly what he was describing. Equipment invoice that never arrived. Invoices that didn't match inventory. Money moving in directions it shouldn't move. She'd seen this before, in different contexts, in different uniforms. The mechanics of corruption didn't change much whether it was happening in a military supply depot or a civilian hospital. The thing is, Hargrove said, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe in a way that made it clear he had no intention of moving, we need some of our more reliable nurses to help smooth out these administrative misunderstandings. To look the other way on certain invoices. It's a courtesy, really. A professional collaboration. And those who are helpful with this kind of thing tend to find themselves with better shift assignments. More weekends off. Better scheduling preference. I'm sure that would appeal to someone in your situation. He was blocking the doorway. His cologne was suffocating. And Brooke could feel the tremor starting again in her hands, but it wasn't fear. It was something else. Something that had been dormant for 2 decades. Something that recognized a threat and wanted to neutralize it. She took one measured breath. I appreciate the offer, Doctor, Brooke said, her voice steady as a surgical instrument. But I'm going to have to decline. The words hung between them in the humming, buzzing silence of the supply room. She could hear the ventilation system working overhead, the subtle whisper of filtered air moving through ducts. She could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. She could hear the distant sound of a trauma monitor beeping from 3 floors below. What she could hear most clearly was Hargrove's moment of surprise, the brief silence that came when someone expected compliance and received refusal instead. I don't think you understand, he said, his voice dropping into something colder. This isn't really optional. This is how we do things here at Mercy General. This is how the system works. Then the system has a problem, Brooke replied. She still hadn't moved. She didn't reach past him for the needles. She simply stood in the center of the supply room, hands at her sides now, perfectly still. I'm not going to participate in invoice fraud. I'm not going to look the other way on equipment discrepancies. And I'm not going to help anyone move money through false paperwork. That's not how I do things. Hargrove's face flushed slightly. He pushed off from the doorframe, his movement suddenly aggressive. You know what? You're making a serious mistake. You're making an enemy here. I have a lot of influence at this hospital. A lot of people who listen to what I say. And if you're not helpful, you're useless to me. And useless things tend to get discarded. He moved past her toward the exit, his shoulder deliberately brushing against hers as he left. The supply room door swung shut behind him with a pneumatic hiss, and the room went completely silent except for the continuous buzzing of the lights overhead. Brooke stood there for a long moment. Her hands were shaking now, but not from fear. She reached for the angiocath needles on the upper shelf and pulled down 2 boxes. Her movements were precise. Controlled. The kind of precise and controlled that came from training that lived in your body long after your mind had tried to forget it. She'd been trained to stay calm under fire. She'd been trained to think clearly when everything around her was chaos. She'd been trained to never let an enemy see that they'd unsettled you. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't retreat to a supply closet to cry or to process what had just happened. She simply took the inventory count from the clipboard, noted the needle count, and headed back downstairs to the trauma bay where a Marine Sergeant Major was waiting to have his life changed by a nurse he didn't yet recognize. The night was just beginning. The cafeteria at Mercy General smelled like industrial bleach masking 3-day-old fryer grease. Brooke carried her sandwich to a corner table at 1,247 hours, the lunch rush in full swing, 43 staff members scattered across the space, the ambient noise of forks and conversation creating the kind of white noise that made her invisible, which was exactly how she preferred it. She'd been working trauma for 8 years since leaving her old life, and invisible meant safe. Invisible meant no one asked questions about the scars on her hands or why she moved like someone who'd learned to fight before she'd learned to talk. She was 3 bites into her turkey club when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut across the cafeteria like a scalpel. "Hey everyone, I'm betting $50 our little wallflower here quits within a week. Any takers?" He stood near the coffee station, gesturing toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His voice carried the particular cruelty of someone who'd never experienced real consequences. Laughter rippled from the surrounding tables like dominoes falling. Surgical residents grinned. Nursing students whispered behind their hands. The attending radiologist actually placed a 20 on the nearest table. Brooke continued chewing. She didn't look up. The sandwich had suddenly become very interesting, the way the tomato slice was slightly off-center, the bread still warm from the morning batch. This was the technique she perfected over 8 years, become furniture. Become part of the room's infrastructure. Exist without existing. But Hargrove wasn't finished. He was never finished. Men like him operated on a principle that predators understood instinctively. They kept pushing until something broke, and the breaking was the entire point. He walked to her table, his $500 shoes announcing themselves on the tile floor with each step, and leaned over her shoulder close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, the expensive cologne that was trying very hard to cover something underneath. "You don't have what it takes for emergency medicine, honey," he said in a stage whisper that everyone in the cafeteria could hear perfectly. "This job requires a spine." A single tear escaped down her left cheek. Just one. She felt it coming and didn't try to stop it because stopping it would have required a reaction, and reactions were the door he was waiting to push through. Instead, she simply let it fall and wiped it away with the back of her hand, her arm perfectly steady, her eyes still fixed on the sandwich. The movement was so controlled it was almost robotic. She stood to leave. That's when his hand moved. He knocked her lunch tray to the floor, past a salad and iced tea and the ceramic plate exploding across the tile in a burst of white noise that made half the cafeteria jump. The sound was enormous in that moment, the shattering glass punctuating his message louder than any words. Then he grabbed a patient chart from the nearest counter and threw it at her feet, pages scattering across the wet tile like snow. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension so thick it was almost visible. The cafeteria went silent. Complete silence. The kind of silence that happens when a line is crossed and everyone in the room suddenly understands they're witnessing something that will either end badly or end with someone else understanding their place in the hierarchy. Brooke knelt slowly. Her right shoulder screamed, an old injury from a medevac mission in 2004 that would never fully heal, would never stop reminding her of what she'd traded for this quiet life, and she began collecting the pages. Every single one. Hargrove watched, his arms crossed, waiting for her to cry harder, to break, to scream back at him. Waiting for the satisfaction of a complete victory. She stood and handed him the chart, her hands perfectly steady. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the cafeteria, a voice like a tank idling in a garage, low, controlled, capable of producing devastation if required. "I've been hit by worse than your insecurity, Doctor." His jaw clenched hard enough that she could see the muscle working. His face went a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was doing something unhealthy. She walked out while nurses whispered, while residents pretended to look at their phones, while the cafeteria slowly remembered how to function again. In the parking lot, her hands finally began to shake. Just a tremor, nothing that would be visible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it, but she felt it anyway, the adrenaline finally arriving late to the party, the autonomic nervous system catching up to what her mind had already processed. She unlocked her car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, hands gripping the wheel, breathing through her nose the way they'd taught her in Kandahar province 20 years ago. Box breathing. For counts in, hold 4, for out, hold 4. After 8 cycles, the shaking stopped. She didn't cry again. The single tear in the cafeteria had been a calculated move, a display of human vulnerability that actually served as armor. Everyone had seen a wounded nurse. No one had seen a warrior evaluating her options. What Brooke didn't tell anyone, what she'd never told her 16-year-old son waiting at home with his homework and his questions about why Mom worked so much, was that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had spent 14 years in the U.S. Navy before medical school. That she'd served 3 tours in Helmand Province. That she'd been medevaced out with a punctured lung and shrapnel embedded in her right hip and had still managed to save 12 civilians during her extraction, holding a position under fire for 6 hours so a convoy could evacuate 24 children from a bombed-out school. That she'd earned her second Purple Heart doing it, and the first one before that, and a Silver Star that lived in a shadow box in her attic because wearing medals to Mercy General would invite questions she'd spent 2 decades avoiding. She'd become a nurse because keeping people alive was the only thing she understood, and she'd chosen San Diego specifically because it was far enough from her old life that the ghosts couldn't find her. 8 years of quiet. 8 years of accepted insults and careful invisibility. 8 years of being just another overqualified trauma nurse who didn't talk much and always showed up on the hardest shifts. Hargrove had made a critical mistake. He thought she was broken. He thought that pushing her would crack her open. He had no idea that the woman he was pushing was someone who'd been trained by the best operators in the US military. Someone whose pain tolerance had been tested in the Hindu Kush. Someone who could compartmentalize trauma so thoroughly that watching a child die in front of her was just data to process and file away. At 2,147 hours, her phone buzzed with a message from the ER charge nurse. Incoming trauma. Marine. Vitals unstable. You're assigned. She started the car and drove back toward Mercy General, toward whatever was waiting in the trauma bay. The night shift was calling her back. She had no idea that waiting for her there, rolling through the ambulance bay doors with his vitals crashing and his oxygen saturation plummeting toward dangerous, was the same small boy she'd pulled from rubble 20 years ago. The same child whose terrified eye she'd carried in her memory every single day since. The same person who was about to recognize her in a way that would destroy every wall she'd built to keep him safe. But that wasn't the worst part. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 2,147 hours. Paramedics wheeled a gurney through the chaos of Mercy General's emergency department, shouting vitals in the clipped rhythm of trained crisis, 34-year-old male, blast trauma, tension pneumothorax, O2 sat 72 and dropping, systolic 68, we've got maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest. The trauma team materialized around the stretcher like an organism with one purpose. Nurses in navy scrubs moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away blood-soaked fatigues to expose the wound. Brooke heard the attending physician call for the chest tray. She heard the names of medications she'd administered 1,000 times. And then she looked at the patient's face. Everything stopped. Her breath. Her hands. The world itself seemed to pause between heartbeats. The boy from Helmand Province lay unconscious on a hospital gurney in San Diego, and he was not a boy anymore. 20 years had carved him into a Marine Sergeant Major with scars along his ribs and a jaw that could cut glass, but his unconscious face held the same terrified geometry she'd carried in her nightmares since the day the school collapsed. She'd pulled him from the rubble when he was 6 years old, his small frame bleeding and shaking. She'd held him for 48 minutes while medevac was inbound. She'd whispered to him that his mother was alive, that everything would be okay, even though she didn't know if either of those things were true. She'd pressed her faded unit patch, the one she still carried, the one sewn inside her jacket lining by his mother's shaking hands, into his palm before handing him to the flight medic. And now he was dying in front of her, his lung collapsed, his blood pressure crashing toward 0. Brooke didn't think. Her hands moved on their own, driven by 20 years of military muscle memory and muscle memory alone. She saw the attending reach for the needle decompression tray. The seconds crawled. Too slow. Her body remembered what her civilian life had tried to bury. She stepped forward, her voice dropping an octave, no longer the submissive nurse who'd nodded at Dr. Hargrove's contempt an hour ago. 14-gauge angiocath, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Not a request. A command. The respiratory tech handed her the needle without hesitation. They could hear the authority in those words, the precision, the absolute certainty of someone who'd done this under fire. She found the space between his ribs by touch. Muscle memory. Years and years of field medicine in desert heat, hand steady as a surgical laser, no tremor, no doubt. The needle slid through skin and intercostal muscle. She felt the subtle give of the pleural membrane. Then, the hiss of air escaping. That small sound, like a tire deflating, like a bomb being disarmed, meant the pressure inside his chest was releasing. His lungs could expand again. She watched his O2 saturation climb on the monitor. 72. 78. 84. 90. The color returned to his face by increments. His blood pressure began its slow crawl upward. 68 became 70. 70 became 82. The attending physician stared at her like she'd just pulled a man from the ocean with her bare hands. The trauma nurse next to her whispered, "How did you know to move that fast?" Brooke didn't answer. She was already moving to the foretray, her hands completing the choreography that had kept 23 Marines alive in Helmand Province and was keeping this one alive now. 18 gauge for rapid transfusion. Type O negative warming in the rapid infuser. 2 units of packed red cells flowing through the line before anyone else had processed what had just happened. She worked with the attending like they'd trained together for months, anticipating movements, moving in fluid unison. The sergeant major stabilized. The crisis held. The room shifted from active chaos into controlled urgency, still dangerous, still fragile, but no longer immediately fatal. And then he grabbed her wrist. His eyes opened. Unfocused. Then sharpening. His grip was weaker than a Marine should have, but his hand held hers with the intensity of a man drowning reaching for anything solid. His voice was a ragged whisper through the oxygen mask, but his words were clear. "What's your name?" Not "what's the nurse's name?" Not "who are you?" The way he asked it, like the answer mattered more than his own fragile heartbeat, made something in her chest twist. His eyes searched hers with a desperate kind of recognition. The corner of his mouth moved toward something that might have been a smile if he had the strength. He was looking at her like he was trying to place a memory that had haunted him for 2 decades. She opened her mouth. Her real name was stuck in her throat, trapped behind 20 years of careful silence. She was about to speak. She was about to break the careful architecture of invisibility she'd constructed since the moment she'd walked away from her previous life and become just another nurse in a hospital full of nurses. But she didn't get the chance. The world exploded. A car had crashed into the building's front entrance at 73 miles per hour. The driver had suffered a massive stroke at the stoplight, foot locked on the accelerator, and had driven directly through the plate glass doors. The impact shattered the framework. Support beams, designed to carry the weight of ceilings and infrastructure, began their catastrophic collapse. And the nearest support beam, the one directly above the trauma bay where Brooke was standing, where the sergeant major was lying conscious and vulnerable on the gurney, buckled and fell like a tree in a gale wind. Brooke saw it in the micro-moment of slow-motion clarity that comes during true crisis. The beam descended. The windows exploded into 1,000 fragments and sheets. Glass became shrapnel. The metal frame twisted and fractured into jagged pieces. Every sharp edge was a weapon spinning through air toward them. She could see the path. Could see where each piece would land. 12 inches away. 8 inches. Getting closer. She didn't think about what she was doing. She threw herself across the sergeant major's gurney, her back toward the explosion, her body a shield across his torso and head. She wrapped her arms around him and pressed her weight down, covering as much of his body as she could manage. The shrapnel hit like fists made of ice. A piece of tempered glass, the size of a fist, tore through her right shoulder blade and exited near her collarbone. White-hot pain bloomed like fire. Before her body could process that, a jagged edge of metal frame punched through her left ribs, angling downward. Then another piece caught her hip. Her scrubs shredded. Her skin split. Her blood, arterial, bright red, sprayed across the sergeant major's hospital gown and his face. She gasped but didn't move. Couldn't move. Had to stay on top of him because the shrapnel was still coming, still spinning, still finding its targets, and as long as she was lying across him, it would hit her instead of him. The bombardment lasted 3 seconds. It felt like hours. When hands grabbed her shoulders and pulled her up and away, her vision was already starting to tunnel at the edges. She could see the sergeant major reaching toward her, his mouth moving, his voice distant and distorted like she was underwater. "No. No, stay with me." Stay, but they were already wheeling him away. They were already shouting her name, asking if she could hear them, if she could stay conscious, applying pressure to the wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. She looked down at her own body. Red had bloomed across her right shoulder like a flower. Red soaked through the left side of her scrubs. Red dripped onto the tile floor. She tried to count how many wounds there were and couldn't keep track. She tried to stand and her legs didn't answer. The pain was information. Pain was data. Pain meant she was still alive. But her vision was narrowing to a pinpoint. Hands were everywhere, compressions, bandages, voices shouting her name like it mattered. Like anyone cared that she was bleeding out on the trauma bay floor. Dr. Hargrove stepped through the chaos and stood above her for exactly 3 seconds. His expression cycled through shock, then something colder. Calculation. Not the look of a colleague concerned for a coworker. The look of a man evaluating a problem. Evaluating an opportunity. He knelt down, ostensibly to help, and whispered something no one else could hear. "You just made this easy." Then he stood and disappeared into the organized emergency of the hospital, where surgeons were already prepping rooms, where administrators were already being notified, where the bureaucratic machinery was already spinning. Brooke tried to speak. Tried to warn someone. But her voice wasn't working anymore. The edges of her vision collapsed to a small tunnel of light. Then even that began to fade. The last thing she felt was the coolness of something being pushed into her full line. Propofol, probably. Sedation. Mercy. She slipped down into darkness that tasted like copper and felt like falling. She didn't see Dr. Hargrove pick up his phone in the corridor. Didn't see him dial board Chairman Morrison. Didn't hear him say, "We have a problem." The nurse who just came in on a trauma case, Brooke Sullivan, she performed an unsanctioned needle decompression. Reckless behavior. Possibly dangerous. "I'm concerned for patient safety. We need to move quickly while she's in surgery." She didn't know that Dr. Hargrove was already building the case against her. Didn't know that fabricated incident reports were being typed by administrative staff. Didn't know that her personnel file was being reviewed by hospital investigators who'd been told she'd performed emergency procedures without authorization, that she'd exhibited erratic and unstable behavior, that she was a liability that needed to be documented and removed from the institution before she hurt someone. She was unconscious, bleeding into surgical bags while a trauma surgeon rebuilt her shoulder, while another doctor stitched the shrapnel wounds in her ribs, while machines breathed for her and pumped blood into her veins and kept the light on inside her body. And in the morning, when she woke in a recovery room with her arm in a sling and her entire left side wrapped in bandages, the hospital's HR department would be waiting with termination papers and a security escort. The recovery room smelled like antiseptic and failure. Brooke's eyes opened to the sound of the ventilator's mechanical wheeze beside her bed, its rhythm steady and relentless, a machine doing the work her body couldn't manage yet. Her right arm lay immobilized in a sling, wrapped so tightly across her chest that breathing hurt. When she tried to move, 17 stitches in her shoulder pulled like fishhooks in skin. Another 12 stitches crossed her ribs where the shrapnel had carved through muscle and pulled her blood into surgical trays. A drain tube ran from beneath her bandages into a clear bulb half full of crimson fluid. She stared at it, watching gravity do its work. Daniel sat in the vinyl chair beside her bed, his 16-year-old frame folded into itself like origami. His phone had died hours ago, and now he just stared at her with eyes that looked too old for his face. Those were Michael's eyes. Brooke's dead husband had left his eyes to their son like a promissory note she'd never be able to repay. When Daniel saw her awake, he stood too quickly, nearly knocked over the water pitcher. "Mom." His voice cracked. "You're awake." She tried to smile. It came out as a grimace. "Hey, buddy." He reached for her hand, the left one, the unbandaged one, and his grip was the grip of a boy who'd spent the last 8 hours believing his mother might not come back from surgery. Brooke squeezed back, the only motion her body could manage without triggering a cascade of pain that felt like broken glass moving through her ribs. They came to the house, Daniel said. His jaw tightened. This morning. Before school. Someone from the hospital. Brooke's eyes closed. No. Not yet. She'd been out of surgery for maybe 3 hours. Daniel pulled a white envelope from his backpack. The paper looked pristine, official, the kind of white that only exists in corporate letterhead. He held it like it might explode. Mom, they fired you. They fired you while you were in surgery. The room tilted. Brooke focused on the ceiling tile directly above her bed, counting the acoustic holes. For a cross. 7 down. 28 holes per tile. She'd been lying in this bed for perhaps 4 hours total, and she was already cataloguing it like inventory in a supply closet. Daniel read the letter aloud because she couldn't bring herself to take it. His voice shook on every important word. Gross negligence. Unauthorized medical procedures. Failure to follow chain of command. A complete and total violation of hospital protocol that endangered patient safety. Effective immediately, she was terminated from her position as registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital and banned from hospital property. A security escort would ensure her compliance. It doesn't make sense, Daniel said. His hands balled into fists. You saved that guy. Everyone's been talking about it. You threw yourself over him. The shrapnel was supposed to, he stopped. Swallowed hard. It was supposed to kill you both. Brooke looked at her son. Really looked at him. This boy had already lost his father. He'd spent the last 18 months watching his mother work night shifts in scrubs, come home smelling like industrial detergent, pretend that everything was normal and fine and safe. She'd built her entire civilian life on the foundation of invisibility. Be small. Be quiet. Be nobody worth noticing. And 3 days ago, she'd blown that apart by instinct, by muscle memory, by the fact that some people you recognize on a cellular level even if 20 years have passed. I'm sorry, she said. For what? For saving someone. She had no answer for that. Dr. Hargrove had been waiting. The moment Brooke's stretcher rolled into the ER with 2 units of O-negative running wide open and a compress on her shoulder, he'd seen opportunity the way a shark sees blood in kelp. The trauma team had wheeled past him. They had a patient to stabilize, a lung to reinflate, shrapnel to account for. But Hargrove stood in the corridor with his hands in his pockets and his mind already 3 moves ahead. He pulled out his phone before Brooke had even reached the OR. The first call was to Margaret Chen, the hospital's chief administrative officer. Margaret owed him a favor from last year when he'd helped her daughter get into a surgical residency program by writing letters to 7 different program directors. The kind of letters that opened doors. Margaret answered on the second ring. I need this handled before she wakes up, Hargrove said quietly, keeping his voice low in case anyone walked past. Brooke Sullivan. The nurse from the lobby incident. I need documentation of unauthorized procedures. Gross negligence. Anything you can write that will hold up to legal review. Margaret's silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. What happened? She performed an emergency procedure on the incoming patient. Needle decompression. Trauma doctors don't typically perform those out of protocol. Neither do RNs. If she's trained in that, she needs to be licensed in it. She wasn't. It was a lie. Emergency nurses in trauma centers performed needle decompression all the time. But Margaret wouldn't know that. Margaret ran numbers and managed liability and took her orders from people like Hargrove who understood how hospitals really worked beneath the veneer of patient care and ethics. I'll get you something by end of day, Margaret said, and hung up. The second call was to Dr. James Pierce, the hospital's director of quality and safety. Pierce was younger than Hargrove, still building his reputation, still hungry to be taken seriously by the establishment. Hargrove had helped him get hired 3 years ago by introducing him to the right board member at the right dinner party. I need you to initiate an investigation into Brooke Sullivan, Hargrove said. Documentation of erratic behavior. I'll provide written statements from staff members about her conduct. What kind of erratic behavior? Pierce asked. Insubordination. Failure to follow protocol. The cafeteria incident last month. Several witnesses. There had been a cafeteria incident. Hargrove had orchestrated it. But Pierce didn't know that. I'll have something on your desk tomorrow morning, Pierce said. He understood the game. The third call was more delicate. Brooke's listed reference from her medical school transcripts was someone named Dr. Sarah Whitmore, affiliated with Naval Hospital San Diego. Hargrove found the number through a patient database search. He wasn't supposed to have access to it, but he'd gotten his password from an IT tech he'd helped get promoted. He dialed. A receptionist answered. Hargrove asked to speak with Dr. Whitmore regarding a former colleague. After a 5-minute hold that filled with elevator music, a woman's voice came on the line. This is Dr. Whitmore. Dr. Whitmore, this is Dr. Richard Hargrove from Mercy General Hospital in San Diego. I'm calling regarding one of your former colleagues, Brooke Sullivan. She's listed you as a reference on her employment file here. I'm sorry, Dr. Whitmore said. I don't have any record of someone by that name in my department. Hargrove's pulse quickened. She would have been discharged from the Navy approximately 20 years ago. Possibly medical corps. Possibly nursing. Dr. Hargrove, I've been at Naval Hospital San Diego for 19 years. I don't recall anyone by that name in any capacity. He thanked her and hung up. The reference was a ghost. Brooke Sullivan had vanished completely from the military apparatus, sealed off, buried so deep that even the Navy had no accessible record of her. Which meant she was either witness protection, unlikely for a nurse, or something else entirely. Something classified. But Hargrove didn't need to know what she was. He just needed the documentation to be solid. 3 days later, the rain in San Diego fell like it was angry. Brooke stood in the Eternal Rest Cemetery, her arm in its sling, her ribs still screaming with every breath, her hospital discharge papers already yellowing in her jacket pocket. The termination letter was there too, dissolving slowly in the moisture seeping through her coat. Michael's headstone was polished granite, the kind that reflected sky. Today it reflected nothing but grey cloud and the shape of a woman who'd failed at everything that mattered. She knelt in the mud. The cold came up through her jeans immediately, but cold was just information. Pain was just data. She'd learned that a long time ago in a place where the temperature swung 90 degrees between day and night and the only warmth came from burning vehicles and burning buildings and burning memories. I'm sorry, she whispered to the stone. I'm so sorry, Michael. The rain hammered the cemetery like applause for a show nobody wanted to see. Brooke pressed her forehead against the headstone, feeling the cold granite bite into her skin. I thought I could do this. I thought I could come here, be normal, be just a nurse, be a mother, be someone who didn't carry the weight of every person I couldn't save. But it follows me. The helm and dust is still in my lungs. The screaming still happens at 3 a.m. And now I've lost the one thing I built that was supposed to be safe. A car passed on the cemetery road, its tires hissing against wet asphalt. Somewhere, someone was living their life. Somewhere, Dr. Hargrove was probably finishing his shift, probably collecting another $500 from whoever was buying his silence about inventory discrepancies, probably not thinking about the nurse he destroyed on his way to another promotion. That Sergeant Major, Brooke said to the stone. He looked at me and something almost came back. Something I've spent 20 years trying to forget. But I couldn't remember his face in the right way. I couldn't place him. And now it's too late. They've taken the hospital away. They'll probably come for the license next. She stayed there for an hour. Rain soaked through her clothes. She stayed anyway. The dead didn't care if you were wet. The dead didn't care about anything. She envied them. The next morning, Brooke drove to Mercy General one final time. The building looked exactly the same as it had looked 3 days ago before everything changed. Same sliding glass doors, same visitor parking, same smell of diesel exhaust mixing with flowers someone had planted in the courtyard in defiance of San Diego's tendency to burn everything to ash. She parked in a staff space she no longer had the right to use. The main lobby was strangely crowded for 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. Usually it was quiet, just visitors moving between departments, volunteers at the information desk, the occasional paramedic steering a patient toward triage. But today there were easily 60 people in the lobby, maybe more, scattered in clusters. Some wore hospital scrubs. Others wore dress blues. Brooke kept her head down and moved toward the staff corridor. Her locker was still in the nurse's station. She had maybe 3 personal items in there, a spare badge, a coffee mug, and the faded unit patch, still in its protective case. She'd retrieve them and leave. In and out. No eye contact. No confrontation. She was very good at disappearing. Dr. Hargrove stood near the information desk with 3 board members and a smile that looked like a predator's before it noticed there was nothing left to hunt. Brooke didn't make eye contact. She focused on the corridor door 20 feet away, kept her breathing steady, kept her movements economical. Every step sent a spike of pain through her ribs, but she'd trained herself not to show pain on her face. Pain was private. Pain was information. Pain could be managed. She was 15 feet from the corridor door when the hospital's main entrance burst open like something had hit it from the outside. Her son was running across the marble lobby holding a shadow box. Brooke's step faltered. The shadow box was wrapped in canvas, sealed with duct tape, the one she'd hidden in the attic wrapped so carefully that no one would ever accidentally find it. "Mom!" Daniel's voice cracked across the lobby, and every head turned. 73 staff members. 3 board members. The security guards at the desk. All of them looking at Brooke. Daniel held the shadow box up to the light. Behind the glass, a silver star gleamed. Daniel's voice echoed through the lobby like a siren nobody could ignore. The shadow box caught the afternoon light pouring through the glass doors, and behind the protective case, medals gleamed, silver star bright as a blade, purple hearts deep as wine, each one a story that had lived in darkness for 2 decades. He was 16 and fearless the way only teenagers are, still believing the world operated on fairness, still believing his mother's secrets were meant to be told. "Mom, they need to see these," he shouted across 73 staff members, for news cameras positioned at angles only a Pentagon liaison could arrange, and one sergeant major in a wheelchair whose entire body went rigid at the sight of those decorations. The ER fell silent. The kind of silence where machines sound louder, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, monitors beat their steady count, the fluorescent lights hummed a frequency that suddenly felt alive with meaning. Brooke stood frozen at her locker, a half-packed cardboard box in her arms, and every calculation she'd made about invisibility collapsed in that single moment of her son's defiance. The termination letter had dissolved in her pocket 3 days ago. Her shoulder still wrapped tight with surgical tape. The job offer from San Francisco in her purse, a fresh start, a new hospital, a place where Dr. Hargrove's lies wouldn't follow. All of it evaporated when Daniel held that shadow box up to the light. Sergeant Major Davis sat upright in his wheelchair for the first time since the explosion, his commanding officer Colonel Martinez standing beside him in dress blues that seemed to make the air itself straighten. Davis's eyes tracked the medals with the focus of a man recognizing his own salvation, and when his gaze reached Brooke's face, something shifted in his expression like the moment recognition hits after years of half-remembered dreams. His voice came out steady, rougher than before from the breathing tube, but clear, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. Not a question. A declaration. An acknowledgement. The room didn't just go quiet, it rewound itself, erased 20 years, and placed a 26-year-old combat medic in scrubs back into the rank and uniform she'd left behind in blood and dust. A woman in a dark suit stepped forward from the gathered staff. Pentagon liaison Harper, her credentials displayed on a leather wallet she held open like a hand being dealt. Behind her, 2 FBI agents in tactical gear positioned themselves at cardinal points, their movements synchronized like they'd done this 100 times before. 3 days ago, Harper announced, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms full of brass. Sergeant Major Davis regained consciousness and recognized Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. He immediately contacted his command. She paused. The camera's red lights blinked. The Marine Corps does not forget those who bled for its people. Harper turned to face Dr. Hargrove directly. He stood near the gift shop, his surgeon's coat still pressed and pristine, his face the color of old bone. The woman moved toward him with the precision of a prosecutor laying out evidence. Sergeant Major Davis spent 72 hours having his command investigate Mercy General's financial records at his request. We uncovered a systematic fraud scheme involving equipment billing, inflation, and kickback payments totaling $2.3 million over 18 months. Your signature appears on 47 falsified invoices. Dr. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish pulled onto a deck. Board Chairman Morrison tried to edge toward the exit, but a third FBI agent, the one nobody had noticed yet, shifted his position with minimal movement that nonetheless felt like a wall materializing. Hargrove's composure cracked like ice in spring. His face flushed from white to red to purple in the space of 3 heartbeats. This is insane. You can't just, she performed unauthorized procedures. She violated protocol. I have documentation. Colonel Martinez stepped forward. His voice came out low and measured, but with a resonance that made grown men flinch, the kind of authority that comes from spending 22 years commanding warriors who'd crossed continents at his word. You fabricated reports against a decorated combat veteran while she was unconscious from wounds sustained protecting one of my Marines. You filed for her termination while she was in recovery from surgery. You contacted her references knowing you were building a case based on false evidence, all while she bled on your hospital floor shielding Sergeant Major Davis from shrapnel that would have killed him. The colonel closed the distance between himself and Hargrove until the doctor had to stumble backward, his heel catching on a plastic potted fern that fell over with a sound like something breaking that couldn't be repaired. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan is hereby reinstated with full back pay and benefits by order of Mercy General's Board of Directors. Effective immediately. He raised a document, official letterhead, multiple signatures, the kind of paper that resets lives. The board met an hour ago. Unanimously. They voted to accept your resignation. Hargrove shook his head. I didn't resign. I'm not. You are now, Harper said flatly. She held up her phone, showing footage of his supply room conversation with a first-year resident where he'd explained the billing scheme in language that sounded like a confession. The call recording, crystal clear. 23 minutes of Dr. Hargrove describing kickback structures to a young doctor he thought he'd intimidated into silence. The resident had been wearing a wire. The FBI had been investigating Mercy General for 11 months. Hargrove's face drained again, leaving him the color of someone who'd just understood that his entire world was collapsing in real time, watched by cameras, immortalized on video that would follow him through every state medical board hearing, every licensing review, every job interview for the rest of his professional life. Colonel Martinez's voice dropped to a register that made the air feel thicker. You are terminated, Dr. Hargrove. Effective immediately. For cause. Security will escort you from the building. You have 5 minutes to collect personal items. Medical license review proceedings commence Monday. Federal charges for healthcare fraud are being filed this afternoon. The colonel raised his voice so every person in the lobby, every nurse who'd watched Hargrove humiliate Brooke, every resident who'd heard him mock her in rounds, every administrator who'd accepted his false reports, could hear clearly, Dr. Jonathan Hargrove, you are fired in front of your colleagues, your staff, and the American public. Guards, now. 2 security officers moved with the efficiency of men who'd been briefed. Hargrove didn't resist as they escorted him toward his office. His face had gone past red into a shade of gray that looked like the color of surrender. Board Chairman Morrison and Regional Director Vance were already being read Miranda rights by the 2nd and 3rd FBI agents. The corruption ran deeper than just Hargrove. It always did. But what mattered in that moment, what made the silence transform from shock into something like exhaled relief, was that Brooke Sullivan, the woman they'd all dismissed as just a nurse, the woman they'd fired while she was still bleeding, had just been vindicated by the Pentagon itself. 6 months later, Brooke sat in her new office on the 3rd floor of Mercy General. The nameplate on her door read Chief of Emergency Nursing in letters that still looked freshly engraved. Outside her window, San Diego sprawled in afternoon light, the harbor visible in the distance where military vessels sat at anchor like whales that had learned to wait. Her shoulder still ached when pressure systems moved through. The scar tissue pulled sometimes when she raised her arm above shoulder height. But it held. It always held. That's what scars did, they reminded you of what you'd survived and bore witness to the fact that you were still here to remember it. On the wall behind her desk, framed in simple blackwood, hung a faded unit patch. The stitching had been reinforced a dozen times by Sergeant Major Davis's mother over the years before he'd given it to Brooke. She'd carried it in her pocket through firefights and evac missions, pressed it against her heart in moments when she thought she might break, kept it close through the 20 years of invisibility that followed. The patch showed the silhouette of a helicopter against a desert sun, barely legible now, the colors faded to almost ghost-like impressions of what they'd once been. It was the most beautiful thing she owned. She touched it every time before she entered the ER. Davis visited every Thursday for physical therapy, always stopped by her office afterward. Today he brought coffee, dark roast from the cafe downstairs, the good kind, not the hospital swill. They didn't talk about Helmand Province or the school or the evacuation or the 20 years of silence that had followed. They talked about his daughter's soccer games, his wife's new promotion, hospital gossip about which nurses were dating which residents, the mundane blessed conversations of people who'd shared something catastrophic and agreed never to excavate it. He sat in the chair across from her desk, his legs still stiff, his movement still careful, but his eyes clear and present in a way they hadn't been when he'd first been wheeled into her ER unconscious and bleeding. Through the window, Brooke could see across the street to the community college. Dr. Hargrove stood in a classroom on the 2nd floor, setting up CPR dummies for a class of bored adults who'd signed up because their employers required certification. He taught minimum wage, no benefits, no pension, no prestige. His medical license remained suspended pending federal investigation. The trial date had been set for March. Board Chairman Morrison and Regional Director Vance awaited sentencing in federal court. The fraud scheme had been so systematic, so calculated, that it had triggered a full HHS review of every hospital in the region. 3 administrators had already resigned. 2 board members were under investigation. Justice operated at the speed of paperwork, but it operated nonetheless. Her son Daniel knocked and poked his head in. He wore dog tags now that belonged to his father, something he'd found in the back of a drawer while Brooke was recovering. Michael's tags, from his time in the Navy before he'd met her, before they'd built a life that had seemed so solid it would never fracture. Daniel had started EMT training 3 weeks ago. He was good at it, intuitive with patients, careful with equipment, born to this work the way his mother had been born to it. He'd watched her save the sergeant major's life. He'd seen what she could do when the weight of her past connected with the necessity of the present. "Chief," he said, using her title the way everyone did now, "we've got a multi-vehicle accident incoming. 12 minutes out. I-5 southbound." Brooke stood. Her shoulder pulled tight with scar tissue but held. She pulled on fresh gloves, the snapping sound of latex against her palms, the smell of talc and plastic, and nodded at her son. "Get the trauma bays prepped. Typo negative for at least 3 units. We'll need orthopedic consult standing by." She moved toward the door, then paused. Her hand reached up to touch the faded unit patch on her wall, a ritual now, a prayer delivered to history instead of heaven. The patch had been with her through evacuation missions and hidden decades. It deserved to witness this too. The hallway felt different now. People moved aside for her, not out of fear the way they had with Hargrove's authority, but out of respect. Brooke Sullivan had bled for a patient. Brooke Sullivan had thrown her body between a wounded Marine and shrapnel. Brooke Sullivan was a decorated combat veteran who'd earned her scars the hardest way possible, by surviving them. As she walked the fluorescent-lit corridor toward the ER, she thought of Michael's grave, how she needed to visit soon and tell him she hadn't failed after all, that their son was becoming what they both wanted him to be, that sometimes the path forward required running backward through the past to reclaim what you'd left behind. In the ER, nurses moved with the coordinated precision of a unit that had learned to trust their leader. They'd tested her. They'd watched how she made decisions under pressure, how she never asked them to do something she wouldn't do herself, how she carried her authority like it was heavy and she was grateful for the weight. One of the residents said something quietly to another resident, and Brooke caught it. Chief Sullivan saved a sergeant major's life and brought down a fraud ring. That's not just a story. That's proof that it matters. The words lodged somewhere deep, in a place that hadn't felt safe enough to hope. The sirens grew louder, 2 ambulances, maybe 3, their wails stacking on top of each other like urgent voices trying to be heard. Brooke pulled on a fresh trauma gown, positioned herself at the receiving station, and touched the edge of her unit patch one more time before the doors burst open and the controlled chaos of emergency medicine took over. This was what she was built for. This was what her body had been trained to do through 2 decades of distance. The words came to her unbidden, something the SEAL commander had said during a ceremony months ago. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. She believed it now. She'd always believed it, actually. She just needed the world to catch up. Like this video if you support our troops. And if you or someone you love has served, let us know in the comments. We'd be honored to hear from you. Subscribe and let's get back to the story.